Picture this scenario. You're sitting across from your financial advisor and they're showing you two identical investment portfolios. Same risk level, same strategy, same everything. But one investor started at age 25 and the other waited until age 35. The difference in their final account balances isn't just a few $1,000s. We're talking about a gap that exceeds most people's entire lifetime earnings. 6 figures, sometimes 7 figures, vanished into thin air because of one simple decision: waiting. My name is Alex, and I spent the better part of 2 decades in investment banking before retiring in my mid-30s. These days, I study finance and wealth creation as a hobby, and I mentor people who want to understand how money really works. And if there's one thing that keeps me awake at night, it's watching brilliant, capable people throw away their financial futures because they think they have more time than they actually do. You know that feeling when you're scrolling through social media and you see your college roommate posting pictures from their 3rd vacation this year, driving a car that costs more than your annual salary, and you can't help but wonder how they afford it all. Maybe you assume they got lucky, inherited money, or landed some dream job that pays ridiculous money. But here's what might surprise you. In many cases, they're not earning dramatically more than you are. They just started investing earlier. That's it. That's the entire secret. Now, before we dive into the mathematics that will probably shock you, let me ask you something. When you think about investing, what comes to mind? Maybe you picture some Wall Street wizard making complicated trades, or perhaps you imagine needing tens of thousands of dollars just to get started. Most people think investing is this complex, intimidating world that requires special knowledge or connections. The truth is, the biggest barrier to building wealth isn't complexity or capital requirements. It's simply time. And the cruel irony is that time is the one resource that gets more expensive every single day you wait. Here's something that most people don't realize, and it's probably the most important concept in all of personal finance. When you're young and broke, you actually possess the most valuable asset in the investment world. It's not money, it's not connections, it's not even intelligence. It's decades of compound growth ahead of you. Every month you delay starting to invest is a month you can never get back. And those lost months don't just cost you the money you could have invested, they cost you all the growth that money would have generated over the next 30 or 40 years. Think about it this way. If you plant an oak tree today, in 40 years you'll have a massive tree providing shade and beauty for generations. But if you wait 10 years to plant that same tree, you don't just lose 10 years of tree growth. You lose the exponential expansion that happens in the later decades when the tree really takes off. Compound interest works exactly the same way. The early years might not look impressive, but they're setting the foundation for explosive growth later on. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looks like in real numbers, because abstract concepts don't pay for retirement. Imagine 2 people, Sarah and Michael. Sarah starts investing $300 per month at age 25. Michael waits until age 35 to start investing the exact same amount. Both of them earn the same 8% annual return, which is roughly what the stock market has averaged over the past century. Both invest until age 65, so Sarah invests for 40 years while Michael invests for 30 years. Now you might think that since Sarah only had a 10-year head start, her account would be maybe 25% larger than Michael's. After all, she only contributed $36,000 more over those extra 10 years. But that's not how compound interest works. When they both reach age 65, Sarah has accumulated over $930,000, while Michael has about $408,000. Sarah's account isn't 25% larger. It's more than double Michael's balance. That 10-year head start resulted in an additional $522,000 in wealth, over $500,000 gone forever because Michael waited. But here's where this gets really interesting, and this is something that will probably make you reconsider everything you think you know about building wealth. Those first 10 years, when Sarah was investing and Michael wasn't, Sarah only contributed $36,000 of her own money. But that $36,000, given 40 years to compound at 8%, grew to over $780,000. This means that Michael's decision to wait cost him more than 20 times his initial investment. 20 times. Let that sink in for a moment. This isn't some get-rich-quick scheme or complicated financial engineering. This is just basic mathematics working over time. Every dollar you invest in your 20s has 4 decades to double, redouble, and double again. Every dollar you invest in your 30s has 3 decades. Every dollar you invest in your 40s has 2 decades. The difference in growth potential is staggering, and it's completely irreversible once those years are gone. Now, you might be thinking that these numbers seem too good to be true. Or maybe you're wondering if an 8% return is realistic. Let me address that concern directly because it's important that you understand these aren't fantasy projections. The S&P 500, which represents the 500 largest companies in America, has averaged about 10% annual returns over the past 90 years. That includes the Great Depression, World War II, multiple recessions, the dot-com crash, the 2008 financial crisis, and the COVID pandemic. Through all of that economic turbulence, patient investors who simply bought and held a diversified portfolio of American businesses earned around 10% annually. I'm using 8% in my examples to be conservative, accounting for inflation and fees. But even if returns were significantly lower, say 6%, the time advantage still creates massive wealth gaps. At 6% annual returns, Sarah would still end up with about $200,000 more than Michael. The exact numbers change, but the principle remains the same. Time is the most powerful force in wealth building, and once it's gone, no amount of money can buy it back. But there's another layer to this story that most people miss entirely, and it might be the most important part of all. When you start investing early, you don't just benefit from longer compound growth. You also develop the habits and mindset that separate wealthy people from everyone else. Investing becomes automatic, a natural part of your monthly routine rather than something you have to force yourself to do later in life when you have more expenses and responsibilities. Think about the psychological difference between someone who starts investing $300 per month at age 25 versus someone who realizes at age 35 that they need to start investing $700 per month to catch up. The first person builds wealth gradually and naturally. The second person faces a financial emergency that requires dramatic lifestyle changes. Which approach do you think leads to more consistent long-term success? Here's something else that happens when you start early that nobody talks about in personal finance articles. You get to make mistakes when they don't matter as much. Everyone makes investment errors, especially in the beginning. You might panic and sell during a market crash or get excited and buy some trendy stock that crashes later. When you're 25 with a small portfolio, these mistakes cost you hundreds or maybe a few $1,000s. When you're 45 trying to catch up with a larger portfolio, the same mistakes can cost you tens of thousands. Early investing isn't just about maximizing returns. It's about maximizing learning opportunities when the stakes are relatively low. By the time you reach your peak earning years, you'll have decades of experience managing market volatility, understanding your own risk tolerance, and avoiding the emotional mistakes that destroy wealth. The hidden cost of waiting to invest isn't just the money you lose to delayed compound growth. It's the confidence you never build, the habits you never develop, and the financial education you never receive when it would have mattered most. There's also a social dimension to this that nobody wants to acknowledge, but it's absolutely crucial to understand if you want to build real wealth. When you start investing early, you begin seeing yourself differently. You stop thinking like a consumer and start thinking like an owner. This identity shift is subtle at first, but it compounds just like your investments do. I remember sitting in a coffee shop a few years ago, overhearing a conversation between two guys in their late 20s. One was complaining about his student loans and credit card debt, saying he couldn't afford to invest anything. The other was talking about how his investment account had just crossed the $50,000 mark. Same age, similar jobs, but completely different financial trajectories. The difference wasn't income, it was mindset and timing. Here's what really struck me about that conversation. The guy with $50,000 invested wasn't bragging or showing off. He was genuinely confused about why his friend thought investing was impossible. To him, putting money into his portfolio every month was as natural as paying his phone bill. He'd been doing it for 5 years, starting with just $100 per month when he got his first real job. His friend, meanwhile, was stuck in what I call the preparation trap. He was waiting until he paid off his student loans, built up a bigger emergency fund, and felt more financially stable before he started investing. In his mind, he was being responsible and logical. In reality, he was costing himself hundreds of thousands of dollars in future wealth. This is where most people get the math completely wrong. They think they need to be debt-free and financially perfect before they can start building wealth. But debt and wealth building aren't mutually exclusive, especially when you're young. If you have a student loan at 4% interest and you can earn 8% in the stock market, you're actually losing money by paying off the loan faster instead of investing. Now, I'm not suggesting you should ignore high-interest credit card debt to invest in stocks. That would be financial suicide. But the idea that you need to have your entire financial life sorted out before you can start investing is one of the most expensive myths in personal finance. It's like saying you can't start exercising until you're already in perfect shape. The reality is that most people will never feel completely ready to start investing. There will always be some expense on the horizon, some financial goal that seems more urgent, some reason to wait just a little bit longer. 6 months turns into a year turns into 5 years, and suddenly you're 35 wondering where all the time went. But here's something that might surprise you about the psychology of early investing. The people who start young don't necessarily have more discipline or better financial education. They just have a different relationship with uncertainty. When you're 25, uncertainty feels exciting rather than terrifying. Taking risks feels natural because you know you have time to recover from mistakes. This is why the traditional financial advice of becoming more conservative as you age is backwards for most people. When you're young with decades ahead of you, you can afford to take risks with your investments because you have time to ride out market volatility. When you're 55 trying to catch up on retirement savings, you actually can't afford to play it safe because safe investments won't generate the returns you need. Think about the irony here. The people who have the most time to recover from investment losses are often the ones who think they can't afford to take risks. Meanwhile, people who are running out of time to build wealth often feel forced into conservative investments that virtually guarantee they'll never reach their financial goals. Let me share something that happened to one of the people I mentor because it perfectly illustrates this backwards thinking. Jessica came to me when she was 28, making about $65,000 per year as a marketing manager. She had $15,000 in her savings account and was proud of her financial discipline. She was also terrified of investing because she'd heard stories about people losing money in the stock market. We spent an hour going through the math, and I showed her that keeping all her money in savings was actually the riskiest thing she could do. At 1% interest, her $15,000 was losing purchasing power every year to inflation. Meanwhile, if she invested it in a simple index fund and it grew at 8% annually, it would be worth over $320,000 by the time she turned 65. The conversation that changed everything was when I asked her a simple question. Jessica, what's scarier to you? The possibility that your investments might lose money for a few years? Or the certainty that you'll never have enough money to retire if you don't start investing? When she put it that way, the choice became obvious. That was 3 years ago. Jessica's investment account has grown to over $75,000, despite contributing only about $1,500 per month. She's lived through a market correction, watched her account balance drop by 20% in a matter of weeks, and experienced the anxiety that comes with seeing red numbers on her investment statements. But she didn't sell. She kept investing, and when the market recovered, her account hit new highs. More importantly, she's developed what I call investor's immunity. Market volatility doesn't scare her anymore because she's experienced it and survived it. She understands that temporary losses are just part of the process, not a sign that she made a mistake. This psychological resilience is worth more than any investment strategy or financial product. Now contrast Jessica's experience with Tom, who came to me last year at age 42. Tom makes $95,000 per year, significantly more than Jessica ever has. But he's just starting to think seriously about investing because he finally feels financially stable. His kids are older, his mortgage payments are manageable, and he has a solid emergency fund. Tom wants to invest aggressively to make up for lost time, but he can't handle the volatility. When his account drops by $5,000 in a bad month, it represents real money that could have paid for his daughter's college textbooks or covered a family vacation. The stakes feel higher because he has less time to recover and more financial responsibilities. This is the cruel mathematics of delayed investing. Not only do you have less time for compound growth, but you also have less tolerance for the volatility that generates higher returns. You end up needing to take bigger risks precisely when you can least afford to take them. The hidden cost of waiting isn't just the money you lose to missed compound growth. It's the confidence you never build, the risk tolerance you never develop, and the peace of mind you never experience. When you start early, investing becomes a boring, automatic process. When you start late, it becomes a source of stress and anxiety that affects every aspect of your financial life. Every aspect of your financial life. But let me tell you about something that happens around the 10 to 15 year mark of consistent investing that completely changes the game. And this is where the psychology gets really fascinating, because it's not just about compound interest anymore. It's about compound confidence. When your investment account crosses certain thresholds, something shifts in your brain that affects every financial decision you make going forward. I call it the momentum effect. And it's probably the most underrated aspect of early investing. When Jessica's account hit $50,000 for the first time, she called me almost in tears. Not because she was upset, but because she finally understood what I'd been trying to explain to her for years. She could see her money working for her in real time. That month, her investments earned more than she made from her weekend side hustle. Money was making money, and she wasn't lifting a finger. That psychological breakthrough is worth more than any investment return because it fundamentally changes how you think about earning and spending. When you watch your portfolio generate $800 in a good month, spending $8 on coffee doesn't feel like a big deal anymore. But spending $800 on something stupid feels devastating because you know exactly what that money could have become if you'd invested it instead. This is where people who started investing late really struggle. And it's something nobody talks about in personal finance circles. When you're 40 trying to catch up, every dollar feels precious because you know you don't have decades for it to compound. You end up obsessing over small expenses while missing the big picture. Meanwhile, people who started early develop this intuitive understanding of opportunity cost that guides their spending decisions automatically. Here's what's really interesting about the momentum effect. Once your investments start generating meaningful returns, the psychological pressure to keep going becomes enormous. When Jessica's account earned $4,000 in a particularly good year, she increased her monthly contributions without me even suggesting it. She couldn't stand the thought of leaving money on the table when she could see so clearly how her investments were growing. Compare that to Tom's experience. When his account drops by $3,000 in a bad month, his first instinct is to reduce his contributions to protect what he has left. Same market conditions, opposite reactions. The difference isn't intelligence or financial knowledge. It's psychological conditioning that can only be developed through years of experience when the stakes are relatively low. There's another hidden cost of waiting that shows up in ways most people never anticipate. When you start investing late, you become incredibly vulnerable to what I call lifestyle inflation pressure. You finally have some money in your investment account, and suddenly everyone around you expects you to spend like you're wealthy. Your friends want to go on expensive trips. Your family assumes you can afford to pick up the dinner tab. Your neighbors expect you to upgrade your house and car. When you've been building wealth gradually for years, these pressures are easier to resist because your identity as an investor is already established. You've learned to say no to expensive things because you've seen how that money compounds over time. But when you're 40 with your first $30,000 investment account, the temptation to spend some of it feels overwhelming because you haven't developed the psychological defenses yet. I watched this happen to a guy named David who started investing at 38 after getting a significant promotion. Within 2 years, he'd accumulated about $45,000 in his portfolio. Then his brother invited him on a European vacation that would have cost $8,000. David convinced himself he deserved it after working so hard to build his savings. He liquidated almost 20% of his portfolio for a 2-week trip. Economist. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with spending money on experiences you value. But David made that decision based on emotion rather than mathematics. That $8,000 given 27 years to compound at 8% would have grown to over $64,000. He essentially paid $64,000 for a 2-week vacation, but he couldn't see it that way because he hadn't developed the long-term thinking that comes with years of investing experience. Jessica, on the other hand, turned down a similar expensive trip the year before without a second thought. Not because she couldn't afford it, but because she could see exactly what that money would become if she left it invested. She'd developed what behavioral economists call temporal discounting immunity. The future value of money felt as real to her as the present value. This brings up something that keeps me awake at night when I think about how many people are missing out on building wealth. The difference between early investors and late investors isn't just financial. It's neurological. When you spend years watching your money compound, your brain literally rewires itself to think differently about spending and saving decisions. Neuroscientists have found that people who invest regularly show increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for long-term planning and impulse control. Meanwhile, people who live paycheck to paycheck show heightened activity in the limbic system, the part of the brain that focuses on immediate gratification. The scary part is that these neural pathways become stronger over time. Waiting to invest isn't just costly financially. It might actually make you worse at making financial decisions in general. Here's something that will probably surprise you about the mathematics of late-stage investing. Let's say Michael, our friend who waited until 35 to start investing, realizes at age 45 that he's way behind on building wealth. He decides to get aggressive and starts investing $1,000 per month instead of the $300 that Sarah has been contributing consistently. Even with these dramatically higher contributions, he still can't catch up. By age 65, Michael will have accumulated about $679,000. That sounds like a lot of money, and it is. But remember, Sarah ends up with over $930,000 despite contributing less money overall. Michael invested $240,000 of his own money over 20 years. Sarah invested $144,000 over 40 years. Michael contributed almost $100,000 more of his own money but still ended up with $250,000 less wealth. Think about the psychological impact of this realization. Michael worked harder, saved more money, and made bigger sacrifices, but he still couldn't overcome the mathematical disadvantage of starting late. That's not just financially devastating. It's emotionally crushing. You end up feeling like you're being punished for decisions you made decades earlier when you didn't fully understand the consequences. This is why I get so frustrated when I see financial advisors telling young people to focus on paying off student loans before they start investing. Yes, debt is bad, and yes, you should work to eliminate it. But the opportunity cost of waiting even 2 or 3 years to start investing can be enormous. Those early years are so mathematically powerful that they can overcome almost any other financial mistake you might make. Let me give you a concrete example of this. Suppose you have $25,000 in student loans at 5% interest and you're debating whether to pay them off aggressively or start investing while making minimum payments. The conventional wisdom says pay off the debt first because you're guaranteed to save 5% by eliminating the interest payments. But here's what the conventional wisdom misses. If you're 25 years old, that money has 40 years to compound in the stock market. At 8% annual returns, every dollar you invest instead of using for extra debt payments becomes $21.72 by the time you retire. Meanwhile, every dollar you use for extra debt payments saves you about $2.65 in interest over the life of the loan. The math isn't even close. You're talking about a 2,000% difference in the final impact of that money. Yet financial advisors routinely tell young people to prioritize debt payoff over investing because it feels safer and more responsible. This advice costs people hundreds of thousands of dollars in lifetime wealth. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not suggesting you should ignore high-interest debt to invest in stocks. If you have credit card debt at 20% interest, that needs to be your first priority. But the idea that you need to be completely debt-free before you can start building wealth is one of the most expensive myths in personal finance. Look, I know this entire conversation might feel overwhelming, especially if you're sitting there realizing you've already lost years to indecision. But here's the thing that gives me hope every single day. Today is still the earliest day for the rest of your investing life. Whether you're 22 or 42, the best time to plant that financial oak tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is right now. The hidden cost of waiting isn't just about the money you've already lost. It's about the money you'll continue to lose every single month you delay taking action. Time is the only investment resource that becomes more expensive every day, and once it's gone, no amount of money can buy it back.